You're listening to Northwoods Church Matters, a podcast of Northwoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, where we discuss why the local church matters and things that matter to the local church. I'm your host, Matt Higgins. Hey, welcome back to the Northwoods Church Matters podcast. We are here again with Rachel Bland, our women's ministry director, girls ministry director as well.
All the things.
And we're going to talk worship again, and we've finally gotten to Leviticus. And so we're going to learn to love Leviticus today, and I'm very excited about that. So why don't we dig in?
Sounds good. The first couple of chapters in Leviticus talk about sacrifices. So what type of sacrifices were there? And this can be confusing when we look at the New Testament for believers.
So. Yeah, because we don't do sacrifices anymore. So the sacrificial system, I think, is confusing for us. And it's almost like in the first couple chapters, there's one type of sacrifice per chapter. So in Leviticus 1, it talks about the general burnt offering, which was a voluntary gift of an animal to the Lord. All of the animal was burnt and given to the Lord. And this was really an atonement for sin. Then Leviticus 2, there's a grain offering, which is a voluntary gift of grain to the Lord. In Leviticus 3, there's a peace offering. So again, that's an animal that is voluntarily given to the Lord, a sign of peace between you and the Lord, the vertical relationship, but also the horizontal relationship. In that situation, part of the animal was eaten and shared as a meal. And so that's a sign of peace between you and others. And then Leviticus 4, you have, if you accidentally sin, what you need to do in order to atone for that sin and the types of offerings, the animals that you need to atone for that sin and the sacrifices you have to give. And then Leviticus 5, if you intentionally sin, sacrifices that you have to make for that sin and restitution that you have to make because you've intentionally sinned against somebody, then that could even be financial, that you have to give up part of your money in order to make somebody whole, which is an interesting principle that I think that we still follow today. But in summary, we see the amount of work that goes into the covering of sin.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Right.
And to maintain this relationship with a holy God. And one of the benefits of reading Leviticus is you read it and you take away, man, thank goodness we don't have to do all this to maintain a relationship with a holy God. And thank goodness that Jesus has done this for us. And the amount of upkeep and the amount of maintenance that would have been required to live in this time was just astounding. And the amount of sacrifice that's given.
Yeah. So that leads us to Leviticus chapter 9. I know we skipped a few chapters.
We skipped a few chapters, but
still.
We're going to camp out more on Leviticus 9 and 10 today.
So in Leviticus 9, we learn about the first sacrifices in the tabernacle. So what was the tabernacle?
The tabernacle is almost like this return to Eden. And so if you read about the tabernacle and the construction of the tabernacle and what it was made of back in Exodus and see it in action here in Leviticus, it's a return to God dwelling amongst his people.
It's actually one of my favorite things to read about.
Right. If you want to do a deep dive and Google some stuff, do a deep dive on the comparison of Eden to the tabernacle and the temple. And then there's also some comparisons to how it talks about heaven in Revelation as well. And so do a deep dive on that. We won't go into that because we don't really have time here. But I think that if you do that, you'll see that God is restoring Eden here. And there was a problem after people were kicked out of the garden. God was no longer dwelling with his people. And this really is a solution to that problem, that God has created a way for God to be with his people again and to dwell with his people. And we should view Leviticus positively in that way. It isn't like God waits till the New Testament to address this problem.
Exactly.
And so because God is living amongst his people, we have to care for our holiness.
Right.
Because if a holy God is living amongst sinful people, we've got to watch out because those two things don't mix. But the tabernacle is not a permanent thing. It was a tent. It was moved around from place to place. But then you see some precursors to the temple. You have certain areas that only the priests can go in. You have certain areas that are segregated for different groups of people. In the center of the tabernacle, of course, is the presence of the Lord and the Ark of the Covenant. And this is where the presence of God resided and rested. And so we see a return to Eden with the tabernacle.
I love that. A lot of times, Leviticus is criticized for the fact that there's so many details this needs to be this amount of square feet, and then this needs to be this fabric. There's all of these rules and regulations and how to do all of this. Some of my favorite things about it is that God continues to equip the people who are building it. He makes a way. God is in the midst of all of those details. And that should be encouraging to us, because if God is in us now through Jesus, the Holy Spirit's dwelling inside of us, then he cares about the details of our life. And I just think that that's so cool that God would love us so much that he would want to care about those.
Yeah, and it points to a couple things that we know about God. God is a God of order and not a God of chaos. He is creator and he knows how to protect us. And so it would be horrible if God just said in Exodus, just build some rando tent.
Right.
And doesn't give a lot of details or a lot of information. But fortunately, he does. And that's because God is a God of order, but also that God is a protector of his people. That all those things are there for protecting his worshipers so that they don't die.
Yeah.
And to find a way to interact with a holy God, even though we're sinful people.
In Leviticus chapter 9, verse 7, what does Moses tell Aaron about these first sacrifices?
So let's take a look at verse 7. It says, Then Moses said to Aaron, Draw near to the altar and offer your sin offering and your burnt offering, and make atonement for yourself and for the people, and bring the offering of the people and make atonement for them, as the Lord has commanded. And so you see in Leviticus 8 and then Leviticus 9, there's this process of consecration of the priests, that the priests have to prepare themselves to meet with a holy God. It says in Leviticus 8 that they would consecrate themselves for 7 days, that they're preparing themselves to meet with God. And then on the 8th day, they go and perform all these sacrifices, which connects to Genesis 1, the days of creation, that God is consecrating them, and then they're made into a new creation, and then they can go into the tabernacle. But there's this extra care of that even though you're mediating for the people, you need to offer sacrifices for yourself first,
right,
lest you die in offering sacrifices for the people. The carefulness of that is just important, that God is caring for the priests as well. But I think one takeaway from that is, do we really prepare well to meet with a holy God?
Oh, I knew you were going to say that. I'm thinking of you and Bobby and Darren and Ryan. I've worked with you all long enough to know that before you guys ever prepare anything or preach anything, you guys are genuinely working that out for yourself. And so I think that's just really cool that you guys are taking to heart. You guys are preparing for this to impact you first in your life, and then you're sharing it with the people. And in essence, it's like what they're doing with these sacrifices. They're taking it for themselves first and then for the people.
I'll take it a little bit even broader, is that when we gather corporately on Sunday as the temple of God, the new temple of God built out of our own bodies, we're meeting with a holy God.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times with New Testament believers, we're too casual with that.
That's good.
And so are we really prepared to meet with the holy God? Because I don't think that some of us think that we're meeting with God when we worship, that we're maybe listening to Bobby preach a sermon, or maybe we'll have some life lessons we can take away.
Right.
But
listen to some good music.
Listen to good music. We're having an encounter with the Lord, who is still holy and still worthy of worship. And the fact that we're maybe Saturday night up until 1 a.m, partying or staying out too late or not sleeping, staying up watching Netflix or binging or whatever we're doing.
Right.
And we get up at 8 a.m. and we're way tired and we're not ready to worship the Lord and our hearts are not in it. That's not a good statement of how we feel about what Sunday morning is.
Right.
That it's not a casual encounter. We really are encountering the Lord, and we should be preparing our hearts as such.
I think that's one of those things that this is a good takeaway, guys. Just take that one away.
Yeah.
Thankfully, we're in a church that preaches passage by passage, verse by verse. So you may not know how far we're going to go, but you know generally what chapter we're going to be in before you even come into church on a Sunday. And I think even reading those is like easy, practical ways that you can take what you're saying and apply it to your life.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think some good practical ways to prepare your heart for worship is, like Rachel said, read the passage, prepare yourself, be in the Word yourself in your own daily devotionals. Pray for what's going to happen on Sunday. Pray for your pastors. Pray for Bobby. Pray for the worship team. Pray for the media team. Pray for greeters. Pray for your teachers that are serving and teaching children and adults. I mean, there's lots of things to be praying over. There's lots of ways that in that way you can prepare for worship, but also treat Sunday morning like it is the main event, not lunch afterwards or the nap you're going to take afterwards, but go to bed on time and get excited for what's going to happen on Sunday morning. Those type of things are important. And the actions that we do shouldn't be ritualistic, but it's an outpouring of that we feel like Sunday is important because it's a gathering to encounter Jesus.
See, y'all didn't know that this is all going to come out of Leviticus.
That's exactly right.
This is why Matt's been looking forward to Leviticus since we started this series.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, what would it have been to participate in tabernacle worship?
So I think there would be two differences. One is just it's bloody. I mean, you go through Leviticus 1 through 5, go through all those lists of sacrifices, with the exception of the grain offering. Everything involves the death of an animal.
Right.
And then the manipulation of the blood of the animal and putting it in certain places.
We definitely don't see that today.
We don't see that today. The tabernacle would have been a very bloody place. And then you would have understood that there is a penalty for sin in order for us to access a holy God.
Okay, so free question here.
Yeah.
Do you think we think about that as believers?
No, I don't think we do. But it was exceptionally bloody what Christ did for us in order to give us access to the cross. And I think we need to consider the cost, consider the pain, consider what Christ did for us, and consider ourselves that Jesus was freeing us of slavery to sin, but there's also language in the New Testament that we are slaves to Christ.
Right.
That he bought us with a price, and so we should be honoring Christ with our bodies as such, that we owe him, that we are indebted to him. Not that what we do is strictly out of groveling or because we're indebted to him. It's really the outpouring of love that we have because he has set us free. But there is a level of, he bought us with a price.
Right.
So we should honor him with our body.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that it would help us to prepare for Sunday if we remembered the cost of our salvation.
Yeah.
If we remembered that bloodiness, so to speak, that there is a payment for sin. And the fact that we didn't have to pay it is huge. That is the gift.
Yeah. And I think another thing that we would notice is the necessity of intermediaries. And I was reading on this week, and I think a good example of this and what it means to be an intermediary is a translator. Like when we go to Ecuador, we have people that help us communicate, that are intermediaries, that are translators, because we don't speak Spanish so good. You've heard Bobby Pell preach.
No bueno.
That's about the extent of a lot of our Spanish.
I think he said on Sunday, no hablo inglés, right? Isn't that, didn't you say
something like that?
Yeah.
But we need people to help us communicate with another culture. And that really is what the priesthood is all about, is that there's sinful people and then there's a holy God. And there's the language of sinfulness and there's the language of a holy God. And what the priests did is they helped sinful people communicate with a holy God.
Yeah, that's good.
And so it's not like you are going into the Holy of Holies and offering sacrifices for yourself. The priests are doing it on your behalf.
Right.
And I think one of the things we lose in the New Testament, that as we've been studying in Hebrews, that we learn about, that Jesus is our intermediary. It's not that we don't have an intermediary. We have a better intermediary, a better high priest than what we had before. It's not our works, it's Christ's works that allows us to communicate with the divine and communicate with the holy.
Can you just tell me this every day? It's such encouraging news, because I think that's where the freedom is in this. Is Paul writes all about it and all throughout the New Testament is like, this is not your own doing. You've not done this work. And it is work. It's hard work. But we've been set free. Jesus has already done the work. It's finished. It's done. Dead, done, gone. He signed, sealed, and delivered us. He was our perfect mediator, a better mediator than any of the priests that we ever could have had, and frees us from having to work for that salvation. I know I needed to hear that. Yeah. So thank you for that.
And one of the blessings of the Reformation and the lessons of the Reformation is that we don't need a priest to communicate with God.
Right.
That we don't need that type of human intermediary anymore, but it's not like we don't need an intermediary at all.
Exactly.
We need Jesus to be our perfect intermediary, and I think that's a huge difference.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so let's talk about God. What was God's response to the people's worship in Leviticus 9?
Leviticus 9 is the perfect example of tabernacle worship. Like the first worship service, everything goes right.
It's the opening service of a new church or something like that.
Exactly. If you're on staff with a church, you know the experience of you have a perfect game or you have a perfect service. Like all the slides are correct and you don't mess up the words of the song and you feel like the sermon goes well and there's like, woo, we did it. We finally did. Well, I feel like that's Leviticus 9. Like a worship service goes perfectly as God intended. And so you see Leviticus 9. This is what happens when people do what God has asked them to do. That you see God is well pleased. So verse 23, it says, Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to the people. So God shows up, and people could see the glory of the Lord. And the fire came out from before the Lord and burnt the burnt offering and the pieces of the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their face.
I have that double underlined in my Bible.
Imagine that worship. Like,
I know.
This is like true worship. Like we encounter God and then we respond to what God has done in our life.
Ugh.
We should get excited for what the Lord has done. Going to the New Testament in the church is like, we don't expect that God's going to show up, for one, which we talked about.
Right.
And if we don't expect that God's going to show up, then we don't worship well because we don't see what God is doing. Then I think that a lot of times from the stage we do see. When I see people that are in tears responding to what we're singing or in tears to what has just been preached, that the word has just been preached, I see a miracle of God happening because we are encountering a holy God. And if we're so casual with worship, then we miss it.
Right.
Because God is moving, whether we know it or not, because He is there. We just need to understand that He is going to do something. William Carey, the great missionary, says that we should have great expectations from God.
Right.
And I think that's what we need to have in worship every single time we come.
Yeah, I'm coming off of camp, right, with our students and stuff. Our students are so excited about camp. And honestly, Crossings does a great job. They have our students fill out these cards. And it's, what are you most looking forward to about camp? I was actually really excited. A lot of our students wrote to just see how God moves in my life or something along those lines. And they were genuinely expectant of what God was going to do. A lot of our students were. All of that to say that I think their hearts were ready. I think they wanted to hear from God, and God showed up, and God did some really crazy things. We had 2 kids come to know Jesus, and we had a lot of students just really genuinely want to repent from sin that was going on in their lives. And as we were talking through this Leviticus, I'm realizing that they were expectant. And that same attitude that our students had towards camp of, we want to see God move. We want to see God show up. We serve the same God, whether we're at Crossings Camp or whether at Northwoods Church or whether you're on your job. God will show up when we expect Him to. It's
a funny thing that I think that simultaneously we can be surprised by God, but expectant of God at the same time. That I think we can expect, yes, God's going to do something, but then still be shocked that God did something. Like last night I was talking to somebody at the new member class about somebody who'd been healed. And it was somebody that had been healed of cancer. They went to the doctor and the cancer was gone, and it was a pastor's wife. And the wife kept on saying over and over again, I can't believe it.
Right.
I can't believe it. And then somebody said to her, well, that's what we've been praying for. And I think that is what the Israelites are experiencing here. How awesome is it to go to a worship service and see God just show off? Right. I know you've been to those worship services before where the pastor doesn't have to say anything or the worship leader doesn't have to do anything. People just respond to God. And those are the worship services I long for, and I hope that we have more of here at Northwoods. So good. Okay, so let's go to Leviticus chapter 10. And y'all, these people have weird names, so I'm going to do my best here. I have a pronunciation thing. You're going to do good. But we'll see about this. So in Leviticus chapter 10, we see 2 people. So who are Nadab and Abihu? Yes. Good job. Good job. Okay, so these are important figures in this section of the Old Testament. These are Aaron's 2 oldest kids. And so the Levites are the clan of the Israelites, which are the priests. Every priest is of Levite heritage. They're the people that are designated in order to be intermediaries to lead worship. And so these are the young up-and-coming guys. Right. So these are the 2 oldest sons. These are the guys that are going to be future priests and future leaders in the temple. Imagine this. So the last verses of chapter 9 talk about the high. The people shouted, and everybody's bowing down, and everybody's so excited God showed up and consume the burnt offering.
Right.
And then verse 1 of chapter 10, there's the great reversal. And before I even get to this, is how quickly do people mess up the sacrificial system?
Yep.
They've had one service. And then verse 1 of chapter 10, now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire on it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord.
Yep.
And it's interesting. The language that's there is the same language about God consuming the sacrifice back in chapter 9. And so the way that the sacrifice was burned up in chapter 9 is the way that Nadab and Abihu were burned up in chapter 10. Very interesting stuff.
Yep. And I'm pretty sure they weren't sacrifices.
Right.
We need to make sure we realize that.
Right.
Okay, so why did they die?
This is an area where a lot of scholars have disagreement because it's not exceptionally clear. It's opaque as to why they died. And so people have lots of theories. Some of them are better than others. A major theory is that they were drunk. And the reason for that is that later on in this passage, it talks about not being drunk before the Lord. I think it's simpler than that. And I think it is that there was a certain way they were supposed to offer up this particular incense and this particular sacrifice, and they didn't follow the rules. And in fact, at the end of Leviticus 8 in verse 35, Moses talks about being careful in how you offer sacrifices so that you do not die.
Right.
And they weren't careful. I think that could be for different reasons. Maybe they were arrogant. They're just like, well, let's take a shortcut.
Right.
We're going to just do what we want because this is just easier. It could be that they're just foolish, that they just didn't know, or they just didn't think enough about it, or they were careless with a holy God.
Right.
I don't think that we know their motivations. And I'm kind of glad that in this passage it is opaque.
Right.
That we don't have a specific reason. And I think by the grace of God, there are some passages where it is unclear on purpose. And I think this is one of these passages where it's unclear on purpose. But the main message is clear if you read from Leviticus 8 to Leviticus 10, which is that God has a certain way that he needs to be worshipped. And if we go out of bounds of that, then it's not good.
Right.
And later on in the chapter, Moses gets on the priests again. Like there's 2 sons of Aaron remaining. These other sons, they mess up a sacrifice as well. And so Moses gets on their back. It's almost like, did you see what happened to the other 2 guys?
Right. Why would you do this?
Why would you do this? You're supposed to eat this food and you didn't eat this food.
Yeah.
I think Moses gets it. The seriousness of encountering a holy God. And I think when you look at Nadab and Abihu, there's a penalty for disobedience to God.
Exactly.
And they pay that price. And I think we've got to watch ourselves when we read passages like this, or I'm thinking about Acts 5, Ananias and Sapphira. Passages like that, we can read them and we're like, God is so mean, or God is so cruel, or some of the commands that God gives in Joshua to wipe people out. God is wiser than we are and knows better than we are. And I think we need to view this through God's lens, not our lens, that holiness demands certain things. And we don't interact with the divine in a careless manner.
I was thinking of even what's happening here with Nadab and Abihu is similar in some regards to what happens with Saul when he makes the sacrifice wrongly as well, right? He doesn't wait for Samuel. God is consistent. He's not changing. The Lord is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so we have to hold tight to that and understanding what you're saying. His ways are not our ways. But we have to trust that he knows what he's doing. We get messed up thinking that we can outthink God. We know better, or I'm just going to go ahead and do this unauthorized. I'm going to do it without permission.
Right.
And that doesn't ever work out well.
Yeah. And I think the takeaway for us is when we come to worship, we worship in a certain manner. It's not as regulated as it is because we don't have the sacrificial system, but there's still things we need to think about when we come to worship. And how are we worshiping? And we don't want to go so far out of bounds, out of what God commands, that we're not worshiping him well. Are we singing the word? Are we praying the word? Are we preaching the word? Are we a word-centered people when we are worshiping? And that is for our own protection and for our own care. that our souls are at stake and God is worthy to be worshiped in a certain manner. And so we're going to ask ourselves certain things like, should we do a drama in worship? Should we do interpretive dance in worship? Should we play a tambourine? Should we have a drum set, which we do? But we ask ourselves these questions, and yes, we talk about these things because we want to make sure that we are being faithful to what God calls us to do, because we don't want to be Nadab and Abihu in worship. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be people that are just like, oh, I'm arrogant, and I think I can just do whatever I want to worship a holy God.
Yeah.
We need to have some consideration of how God wants us to worship.
Yeah. So shameless plug here for Jackie Hill Perry's Holier Than Thou book. It is phenomenal, and it talks a lot about this. And I've been really challenged and encouraged by examining God's holiness, because I think especially we talk about God's love a lot. We talk about how he's a loving God, he's merciful, he's compassionate. Sometimes I think his holiness, kind of like what we're talking about today, we don't actually talk about it. We miss it. But that's actually so central to who God is and his character, because if we understand his holiness, it makes his love that much deeper. It makes his mercy that much deeper, because you understand that God, being so holy, had really no business in making any of us clean. So it's a great book. So I would definitely encourage people to read that one.
Yeah, me too. That's a good book. I was watching TV this morning, and I won't name the show, but there's this situation in the TV show where there's kerosene on the floor. It's almost cliche. Mm-hmm. Like there's kerosene, gasoline on the floor, and then somebody's holding a lighter or an open flame. And you don't want those two things to mix. Otherwise, there's going to be an explosion and everybody dies.
Right.
And I think that we think about God in Old Testament terms that way.
Yeah.
That Old Testament God, if we don't interact with Old Testament God in a proper way, then everything is going to explode. But in New Testament, we don't think about God that way.
Exactly.
And I think we need to think about that more, because God has not changed. His holiness has not changed. And I think that we're probably more careless than Nadab and Abihu in dealing with God.
That's a great point.
But I think that you also see that there is love and care in Leviticus, that God has created us a way to be with him. Mm-hmm. We just need to be faithful to him and trust that he knows what he's doing. And maybe Nadab and Abihu didn't just trust what God had told them. And we just simply need to be obedient sheep and follow what the shepherd is telling us to do.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good to talk about his holiness, because it really puts me personally in check as far as just a reminder of how holy he is and how unholy I am. But then the fact that you said in his loving character, he still made a way to dwell amongst a sinful nation.
Yeah.
And let's just remember that one verse later, there are people who are sinning against him.
Yeah.
And God demonstrates his holiness and his wrath in that, but yet he's still demonstrating long-suffering patience with the people.
Yeah. And so there's an interesting reaction to this that I didn't get to, but I think it's worth mentioning. Immediately after these two guys die, in verse 3, it says, "Then Moses said to Aaron, 'This is what the Lord has said, amongst those who are near me I will be sanctified, and before all people I will be glorified.' And Aaron held his peace." Mm-hmm. Aaron didn't say anything.
Yeah.
And so as the high priest, Aaron knew that his kids messed up. Mm-hmm. And so he's not mourning, he's not wailing, he's not shouting. He's like, yep. And think about what it must have meant for him to just squelch that whole feeling of fatherhood that my two kids have died. But he understands that there's a holy God that demands to be worshipped in a certain way, and he gets it. But looking at Moses' words are important too. "Amongst those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before the people, I will be glorified." God will be holy, and he will be glorified, regardless of what we do.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, so the last thing that we always end up with is how this story teaches us about worship. So what do we learn about worship here?
Yeah, I think that we just need to be not careless with worship. I think that's one of the lessons, is that there's order to worship. That's one of the points that's hit on in, I think, an important couple chapters for New Testament worship is 1 Corinthians chapters 12 through 14. In that particular passage, it actually mentions in chapter 14 that God is a God of order and not chaos. And there comes this situation where people are preaching in tongues and different languages, and people just don't understand what people are saying to one another. And Paul's admonition is we need to be worshiping in an orderly fashion, worship in a way that the Lord wants us to, and not just have a chaotic worship service, that the purpose is the glorification of God and the edification of the believers. And the principle continues on today that it's not just a free-for-all for us to do whatever we want.
Right.
And I think it's good for us to ask those things about what is appropriate or not appropriate in worship. And I love my charismatic and Pentecostal brothers and sisters, but I think part of what we should be asking ourselves in worship is, are some of these things that are a little bit more far afield appropriate to worship God? And I'm not going to dig into details on that, but I think that it's always good to ask the question.
Right. Yeah. Questions are our friend.
Yeah. Questions are our friend.
That's a good way to end.
Yes. Questions are friends. Let me just close with one thought, which is in another question, which is, do you understand the magnitude of what you're doing on Sunday?
That's good.
I don't think we do often enough. And I think we see the consistency throughout all these worship podcasts. There's so much consecration and preparation that goes into the adoration of the Lord. And I don't think that we do that. And I think that's just a shame, because my God deserves better than that. And so we need to do well.
That's good.
That's a good way to end.
Good job, Matt.
All right. See you next time, guys. We'll talk about the Day of Atonement.
Whoop, whoop.
Thanks for tuning in to the Northwoods Church Matters podcast. If you'd like to find out more about Northwoods Church, you can visit us at our website, www.northwoodschurch.org. Again, that's www.northwoodschurch.org.